The storm raged like a furious beast, swallowing everything in its path. But amidst the howling wind and crashing waves, something struggled against the current. A black plastic bag, barely afloat. Inside, a tiny, helpless puppy fought for its life. On the riverbank, Thomas, an old fisherman, squinted through the rain, his heart clenched as he spotted the moving bag drifting away. Without hesitation, he plunged into the icy waters. What he pulled out was more than just a half-drowned puppy. It was the beginning of something extraordinary. But he had no idea yet that this moment would change his life forever. The rain pounded against the earth like a relentless drum, turning the river into a raging beast. The wind howled through the trees, bending their branches as if they were mere twigs. Thunder cracked overhead, momentarily illuminating the darkened sky. Beneath that furious storm, something barely floated, tossed and swallowed by the merciless currents. A black plastic bag, twisted and contorted by the waves, bobbed up and down before being dragged further downstream. Inside that bag, a tiny golden retriever puppy trembled, its small body barely able to move. The pup, no older than 6 weeks, was soaked to the bone, its golden fur matted and clinging to its frail frame. It had been separated from its mother far too soon, and now it was suffocating, gasping for air as water seeped into the tiny gaps of the bag. Every instinct screamed for survival, but the odds were against it. Not far from the river's edge, Thomas Whitmore sat in his old fishing boat, cursing the storm under his breath. The 70-year-old fisherman had lived by this river his entire life, and he had never seen it this wild before. The years had weathered him. His broad shoulders had begun to hunch. His strong hands now bore deep lines from decades of hauling nets and mending sails. His face was a roadmap of time, his thick gray beard tangled from neglect. Thomas had always been a man of solitude. Ever since his wife, Margaret, passed 15 years ago, he had drifted through life much like his boat on a still morning, slow, steady, and without direction. His son had left for the city long ago, barely keeping in touch. The river was all he had left. But something in the water caught his eye. At first, he thought it was nothing more than debris, a piece of trash thrown away like so many things in this world. But then, the bag moved. Thomas squinted through the sheets of rain. It was small, too small for just garbage. Then he saw it. Something inside was struggling. His heart clenched. Without a second thought, he grabbed his long wooden pole and leaned dangerously over the edge of his boat, trying to hook the drifting bag before the river swallowed it completely. The waves fought against him, the wind nearly toppling him over, but he refused to let go. After a few agonizing moments, the bag snagged on his pole. Thomas pulled with all his might, gritting his teeth as his old muscles strained against the force of the current. With one final yank, he hauled the soaked bag onto his boat, water spilling from its torn edges. His hands shook as he ripped it open. A gasp caught in his throat. A tiny golden retriever puppy lay there, barely breathing. Its fur, which should have been a beautiful shade of golden cream, was now soaked, its tiny body trembling violently from the cold. Its dark eyes, wide with fear, locked onto his, pleading for warmth, for safety, for life. "Jesus," Thomas muttered, his hands, rough and calloused, gently scooped up the fragile pup, holding it close to his chest. It was ice cold, its tiny heart pounding erratically. No time to hesitate. He turned his boat toward the shore, pushing the motor harder than he had in years. The storm fought him every step of the way, but Thomas was determined. Minutes felt like hours, but finally, his boat scraped against the muddy riverbank. He jumped off, cradling the puppy against his rain-soaked coat as he rushed toward his cabin. His boots splashed through the puddles, his breath coming in heavy puffs as he forced his tired legs to move faster. The cabin was small, nothing more than a wooden structure weathered by time. Once, it had been a home, filled with laughter and warmth. Now, it was a shelter for an old man who had long since stopped expecting company. Inside, the air was cold. The fire had nearly died out, leaving only weak embers glowing in the hearth. With practiced hands, Thomas set the puppy down on a blanket near the fireplace, quickly tossing in more logs and stoking the flames back to life. The golden glow flickered across the tiny body lying still on the floor. "You're a stubborn little thing," Thomas murmured as he knelt beside the puppy, rubbing its tiny body to bring warmth back into its bones. The pup whimpered softly, barely moving. Its tiny ears twitched, as if responding to his voice. Thomas felt something in his chest tighten. It had been so long since he had cared for anything other than himself. The last time he had held something this small, this helpless, had been years ago, when his son was just a boy, when his wife was still alive, when life had felt full instead of empty. A bitter memory surfaced. His son had once found a stray puppy and begged to keep it. Thomas had said no. They couldn't afford another mouth to feed, and he had always believed that stray dogs never lasted long. He had been right. The dog had vanished a few weeks later, and his son had cried for days. Now, looking at this tiny creature, clinging to life against all odds, Thomas felt something stir within him. Regret, perhaps. Or maybe, just maybe, a second chance. "You're not going anywhere," he said, voice gruff but gentle. He reached for an old flannel blanket and wrapped the puppy carefully, holding it close to his chest, as he sat down in his worn-out armchair. The storm outside raged on, but inside, for the first time in years, there was warmth. Thomas sat by the fire, his old hands carefully rubbing the damp fur of the tiny golden retriever wrapped in a flannel blanket. The warmth of the fire flickered against its small body, chasing away the chill that had threatened to take it. The puppy was still trembling, its eyes heavy with exhaustion, but there was something in the way it nestled against him that made his chest tighten. Trust. Blind, unconditional trust, he sighed, glancing out the small window. The storm outside showed no sign of relenting, the rain still pounding against the roof, the wind rattling the wooden walls of the cabin. He ran his rough fingers gently over the pup's head, feeling the softness beneath the dirt. It needed a name, something fitting. "River," he murmured, almost testing the word on his tongue. The name felt right. After all, that was where he had found it, where it had fought against the currents, refusing to let go. A survivor. Just like him. River's small ears twitched at the sound of his voice, but it remained curled in his arms, too tired to move. Thomas leaned back in his worn-out chair, the warmth of the fire wrapping around both of them. His mind drifted, carried away by the quiet crackling of the flames. And then, unbidden, the past crept in. It had been more than 20 years, but the memory was as sharp as ever. Another storm. Another night like this. And another dog. Max. Max had been his hunting companion, a strong, loyal hound with deep brown eyes and a coat as dark as the earth itself. Unlike River, Max had not been found. He had been chosen. Thomas had raised him from a pup, trained him, cared for him, trusted him. They had been inseparable, until that night. The night of the accident, Thomas could still hear the rushing water, the same river that had nearly taken River tonight. Max had chased something, maybe a deer, maybe nothing at all, but the ground had been slick, the banks unstable. One misstep, and Max had gone tumbling into the current. Thomas had run, desperate, screaming his name into the storm, but the river had been cruel. He had jumped in, fought against the same violent waters that had tried to claim River tonight, but it had been too late. Max was gone. Thomas had never forgiven himself. The weight of that night had settled on his shoulders like an invisible burden, one he had carried for decades. It was why he never got another dog, why he had never let himself care again. But now, as he looked down at the tiny creature sleeping against his chest, he felt something he hadn't in years, something that scared him. Hope. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean by the rain. The river had calmed, though its banks were still swollen with the aftermath. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine through the cracks in the cabin's walls. Thomas stirred in his chair, blinking at the weak morning light seeping through the window. The weight on his chest shifted, and for a moment he panicked, until he looked down. River was still there, curled up, its small body rising and falling with each steady breath. For the first time in years, Thomas didn't wake up alone. He gently unwrapped the puppy from the blanket, setting it down on the rug near the fireplace. River whimpered at the loss of warmth, but didn't wake. Thomas rubbed his stiff joints, standing with a quiet groan. His body always ached in the mornings. Age had seen to that. He moved toward the small wooden counter, setting water to boil over the old stove. His cabin was simple, built for function, not comfort. The wooden beams had darkened over time, and the shelves were cluttered with relics of a life that had once been fuller. Margaret's ceramic mugs, his son's old fishing rod, a photograph in a dusty frame that he hadn't looked at in years. As the kettle whistled, Thomas poured himself a cup of black coffee, the bitterness familiar and grounding. He glanced at River, who stirred slightly, stretching its tiny legs before curling up tighter. The pup needed food. With practice motions, he reached into the small cabinet and pulled out a can of old soup, then hesitated. No, the puppy couldn't eat that. He frowned, thinking. He had some eggs. Maybe some milk. Before he could start, there was a knock at the door. Thomas frowned. No one ever came out this far. His cabin was at the edge of the river, past the main town. People didn't visit unless they had a reason. He set down his coffee and moved to the door, unlocking it with a quick twist. Standing on the porch was Sarah Bennett. Sarah had lived in town her entire life, just like him. She was in her mid-60s, but time had been kind to her. Tall and lean, with sharp green eyes that saw more than she let on. She had always been a woman who carried herself with quiet strength, the kind that came from years of surviving life's hardships. Her hair, once a rich auburn, had faded into a soft silver, always tied back in a loose braid. She wore a thick coat, a scarf wrapped tight against the morning chill. "You look like hell," she said, her voice dry, though not unkind. Thomas snorted. "Good morning to you, too." Sarah glanced past him, her gaze settling on something inside. "You got company?" He hesitated, then stepped aside enough for her to see. She blinked. "That a dog?" "A pup." She frowned. "That's not yours?" "No," Thomas admitted. "Found it in the river last night." Sarah exhaled, shaking her head. "Damn people. Tossing animals like trash." She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, shaking off the rain from her coat. She had been a school teacher before she retired, and she still carried the habit of taking charge in situations whether people wanted her to or not. Thomas closed the door behind her, watching as she knelt near the fireplace. River, now partially awake, sniffed the air but didn't move. Sarah softened, reaching out gently. "Poor thing." Thomas crossed his arms. "You know anything about taking care of puppies?" She gave him a look. "I raised 3 kids and ran a farm for 30 years. What do you think?" He grunted. Sarah sighed, standing. "I'll bring by some proper food later. Puppy formula, maybe some blankets." "I don't need help. I wasn't asking." She pulled on her gloves. "Keep it warm, make sure it eats. And Thomas..." He looked up. Her expression softened, just slightly. "Maybe it's not the worst thing, letting something in again." With that, she left, leaving Thomas standing in the quiet cabin, the weight of her words lingering in the air. He looked back at River, who had finally lifted its head, blinking at him with those trusting brown eyes. Thomas exhaled. Maybe Sarah was right. The days turned into weeks, and before Thomas realized it, River had become more than just a stray puppy he had rescued. The little golden retriever grew fast, its soft golden fur thickening, taking on a warm, almost sunlit hue. Its body became stronger, its legs more steady, and soon, the once fragile creature that had fit into Thomas's hands was bounding around the cabin with a clumsy enthusiasm that made even the gruff old fisherman crack the rare smile. Thomas had never intended to keep the pup. At first, he told himself it was temporary, just until River was strong enough to be given to someone else. But with each passing day, that thought became less and less convincing. River followed him everywhere, from the small wooden dock where Thomas repaired his fishing nets to the shed where he kept old tools no longer in use. The dog had a way of slipping under his chair when he sat outside in the evenings, its head resting against his boot, as if it had always belonged there. Most nights, Thomas would wake up to find River curled beside his chair near the fireplace, just like Max had once done. It was an odd habit, one he hadn't taught. He had tried making River sleep on an old cushion in the corner, but every morning he would find the dog back by his side, nose tucked into his leg, ears twitching as if listening for the rhythm of his breath. Then there was the barking. River, despite its gentle nature, had a sharp sense of alertness. Whenever someone approached the cabin, whether it was Sarah bringing supplies or the occasional lost traveler stopping to ask for directions, the pup would let out a deep, resonant bark, its stance protective. It wasn't aggression, just a natural wariness, the same instinct Max had once displayed. Thomas never had to teach Max to guard the house. just like he never had to teach River now. But the strangest thing happened one crisp autumn morning. Thomas had taken River for a walk along the riverbank, the morning mist still clinging to the surface of the water. The golden leaves rustled gently under his boots, and River trotted ahead, tail wagging, nose buried in the damp earth. It had rained the night before, and the scent of wet foliage lingered in the air. The dog was playful, darting back and forth, chasing the wind as if it were something tangible. Then, suddenly, River froze. Its ears perked up, its body stiffening. "What is it, boy?" Thomas asked, his brow furrowing. River didn't respond at first. Instead, it took a few cautious steps forward before lowering its nose to the ground, sniffing intensely. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, it raised a paw and placed it down carefully, hesitant, almost reverent. That's when Thomas saw it, a scar, a faint, nearly invisible scar just above River's front left paw. His breath caught in his throat. It was in the exact same place Max had once been injured. Thomas felt his knees weaken, the weight of something unspoken pressing down on him. It was impossible. He had seen Max go under, had felt the river's cruelty take him away. There was no logic to it, no explanation that made sense. And yet, as he stared at River, who now looked back at him with those same deep, soulful eyes, he couldn't shake the feeling gnawing at his chest. Had the universe somehow given Max back to him? "You're just imagining things," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head as if to dismiss the thought. But even as he walked back to the cabin, River padding beside him, the unease remained. Later that evening, as Thomas sat in his worn-out chair by the fire, River curled up beside him, pressing its warm body against his leg. The old fisherman absent-mindedly ran his fingers through the dog's fur, his mind lost in memories. He thought about all the nights he had spent alone, staring at the same flickering fire, listening to the same howling wind outside. He had never questioned why he had chosen to live like this, away from the world, away from people. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was grief. Maybe it was just easier to forget when no one was around to remind him. But now, with River beside him, the cabin no longer felt quite so empty. Sarah had noticed the change too. The next time she stopped by, arms full of supplies, she eyed the dog with an amused smirk. "You're keeping it," she said matter-of-factly, setting down a bag of fresh food on the counter. Thomas grunted. "Never said that." Sarah crossed her arms, raising an eyebrow. "Uh-huh. And yet, he's sleeping in your chair, eating food from your kitchen, and following you around like a shadow." Thomas grumbled something incoherent under his breath, but Sarah wasn't fooled. She had known him too long. "What's his name?" she asked. "River." A slow, knowing smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "Fitting," she said, considering where he came from. Thomas didn't respond, just reached for his coffee, pretending to be uninterested. But Sarah wasn't one to let things go so easily. "You ever think," she continued, "that sometimes life gives us second chances in ways we don't expect?" He stiffened slightly, his fingers tightening around the mug. He didn't look at her, but she didn't need him to answer. Sarah had always been perceptive. It was part of who she was. Sharp-eyed, quietly observant. She had spent her whole life reading people, first as a school teacher, then as a mother, and later, after her husband passed, as the unofficial caretaker of the small riverside town. She wasn't the type to pry, but she also wasn't the type to ignore the things left unsaid. She reached down, scratching River behind the ears. "You know," she mused, "dogs have a way of finding the people who need them the most." Thomas exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his tired face. He didn't have a response to that. Sarah stood, brushing off her coat. "I'll be back in a few days. Try not to scare him off with all that grumbling." As she left, Thomas remained seated, watching the firelight dance in River's dark eyes. The dog looked up at him, tail thumping once against the floor. Thomas sighed. "Looks like you're staying, then?" River licked his hand, settling deeper against his leg. And for the first time in a long time, Thomas let himself believe, just a little, that maybe, just maybe, life wasn't done with him yet. The evening sky was heavy with dark clouds, pressing low over the quiet river town. A thick humidity hung in the air, clinging to everything like an unspoken omen. Thomas had seen storms before, plenty of them, but something about tonight felt different. The wind carried an eerie stillness, a deceptive calm. that only deepened the unease twisting in his gut. River sensed it too. The young golden retriever had spent the entire evening restless, pacing near the front door, ears pricked at sounds only he could hear. Normally, River would curl up beside Thomas's chair, content to rest by the fire, but tonight was different. The pup's golden coat bristled as he let out a deep, rumbling growl, staring toward the window as if expecting something to emerge from the darkness. Thomas watched him, setting down his mug of coffee. "What's got into you, boy?" River didn't respond. He never did to idle words. But his body stiffened, and then without warning, he bolted toward the door, barking wildly. His front paws scratched against the wood, desperate. Thomas frowned, the unease in his stomach tightening. River was not the kind of dog to make a fuss over nothing. Grabbing his coat, Thomas pushed open the door. The moment he did, River shot past him into the night, paws kicking up damp earth as he ran toward the riverbank. The old fisherman hesitated only for a second before following. The moment he stepped outside, he knew something was wrong. The air was thick with moisture, the kind that clung to his skin and made breathing feel heavier. The sky rumbled ominously, though no rain had fallen yet. The river, normally steady and predictable, was moving faster than usual, swollen from the previous week's rainfall. Then he saw it. A long, jagged crack running along the side of the earthen dam just beyond his property. Thomas's breath hitched. The dam had been there for decades, built to control the river's flow during storms. It had withstood countless floods, its structure a silent guardian of the town. But now, beneath the weight of the rising waters, it was failing. And nobody knew. River barked furiously, circling the damaged section, his paws kicking up loose soil. The message was clear. Do something. Thomas didn't waste time. He turned and ran, his boots sinking into the wet ground as he sprinted toward town. He hadn't run this fast in years, but fear pushed him forward, ignoring the burn in his legs. By the time he reached the town center, sweat dripped from his brow despite the cold air. He burst into the small municipal office where a handful of town officials were finishing up their day. Sheriff Mark Calloway was among them, a man in his mid-40s with broad shoulders and a perpetual look of skepticism. He had lived in the town his whole life, a firm believer in logic and practicality. His uniform was neatly pressed, his dark hair combed back, but his eyes carried the weariness of someone who had long stopped believing in emergencies that weren't immediate. Thomas stormed in, chest heaving. "The dam," he managed between breaths. "It's breaking." Calloway barely looked up from his paperwork. "Thomas, it's been there for 50 years. It's fine." "It's not fine," Thomas snapped. "There's a crack running through it and the water's rising. If that thing goes, the entire lower town is gone." A few of the other officials exchanged glances, but Calloway only sighed, rubbing his temple. "Look, Thomas, we'll check it in the morning." "Morning?" Thomas's voice rose with frustration. "By morning, there won't be a damn town left. I'm sure it's just—" The lights flickered. A low, guttural rumble vibrated through the floor, followed by a distant but unmistakable sound. A roar, deep and primal. The dam was breaking. Then, as if the sky itself had been waiting for its cue, the first drop of rain fell. Then another. Within seconds, it was pouring. Someone screamed outside. The distant sound of rushing water reached them before they even saw it. Calloway bolted to his feet, finally understanding. "God help us!" Chaos erupted. People shouted orders, grabbing radios and ringing emergency bells. The town had protocols for floods, but no one had expected this. Thomas didn't wait. He turned and ran back toward his cabin. The rain lashed against his skin as he fought against the storm, his boots slipping in the thickening mud. He could hear it now. The river. No longer just a river, but a beast, roaring as it tore through the weakened dam, swallowing everything in its path. The ground trembled beneath him. Then the wall of water came. It moved with terrifying speed, a force that cared nothing for the lives in its way. Thomas barely had time to react before he felt the impact. The wave slammed into him, knocking him off his feet, the icy grip of the flood dragging him under. For a moment, everything was chaos. Water filled his ears, his lungs burned, and the world became nothing but a swirling abyss of darkness. He fought, kicking, clawing, but the current was stronger. It pulled him under, twisting his body like a rag doll. He was going to die, and then something latched onto him. A grip, firm and unyielding. River. The dog had leaped into the flood without hesitation. His teeth clamped onto Thomas's sleeve, his body working against the current, paddling with every ounce of strength he had. Thomas coughed, barely conscious, but the warmth of River's body against him kept him tethered to reality. Through sheer determination, the dog pulled him toward a half-submerged tree, where Thomas managed to grab hold, gasping for air. The water still raged, but they had a lifeline. River whimpered, his fur slicked against his body, but he did not let go. Thomas, his limbs shaking, pulled himself up, wrapping an arm around River to keep him close. The storm raged on, but they were alive. And as Thomas looked into the dog's exhausted but determined eyes, he knew, without a doubt, River had saved him. Just as Max had tried to, all those years ago. Thomas gasped awake, his body aching as if he had been trampled by a freight train. His head pounded, his limbs felt sluggish, and for a moment he couldn't remember where he was. The world around him was eerily quiet, save for the distant roar of water and the occasional creak of shifting wood beneath him. Then it came back to him. The flood, the dam breaking, the wave that had swallowed him whole. He had been drowning, dragged by the current, and then River. His eyes snapped open fully. He was on the roof of his cabin, the only part of his home that hadn't been completely submerged. The waters had risen high, swallowing the first floor, leaving only the slanted shingles of the roof as a fragile sanctuary. Beside him, River stood, soaked to the bone, his golden fur clinging to his thin frame. The dog was trembling, his body racked with exhaustion, but he didn't sit. He stayed close, watchful, as if making sure Thomas was still breathing. "Good boy," Thomas rasped, reaching out with a shaking hand. River pressed his nose into his palm, his eyes filled with that quiet, unwavering trust. The sky was a dull gray, the storm's fury finally beginning to wane, but the devastation it left behind stretched for miles. Thomas could see broken trees, bits of shattered homes, and household debris floating past in the current. The river, once a familiar friend, had become something monstrous. Then he heard it. A cry. Faint but desperate. Thomas turned his head sharply, searching the waterlogged wasteland. The cry came again, high-pitched, terrified. And then he saw it. A child. No older than 5 or 6, clinging to a half-submerged tree as the current dragged them further downstream. A boy, small and frail, wearing a soaked red jacket. His tiny fingers were wrapped around the bark with a death grip, his face twisted in terror. Thomas's heart clenched. He tried to move, but his body was still weak, his limbs sluggish. He could barely keep himself upright on the roof. There was no way he could swim through that water and reach the child in time. Then, beside him, River moved. The dog's ears pricked forward, his gaze locked onto the boy. He turned to Thomas, then back at the struggling child, as if he understood what needed to be done. Thomas opened his mouth to say something, but before he could, River leaped. The golden retriever hit the water with a splash, disappearing beneath the churning waves for a second before resurfacing. His legs pumped furiously, his body cutting through the water with powerful, determined strokes. Thomas held his breath. The current was brutal, slamming River sideways, but the dog didn't waver. He pushed forward, his head barely above the water as he fought against the tide. Closer, closer. The boy's eyes widened as River reached him. The child let out a choked sob, his fingers slipping against the wet bark. He wouldn't last much longer. Then, River did something remarkable. Instead of trying to grab the boy directly, the dog bit down on the fabric of his jacket, tugging him with surprising gentleness. The boy gasped, his grip faltering, but River held steady. Slowly, inch by inch, he pulled him away from the sinking tree, guiding him back toward Thomas and the fragile safety of the rooftop. Thomas crawled forward, reaching as far as he could. "Come on, boy, just a little more." River swam with everything he had. His muscles burned, his limbs screamed for rest, but he kept going. The water fought back, the current twisting and pulling, but he refused to let go. Then, a log, thick, jagged, a piece of shattered debris carried by the flood, moving too fast for Thomas to shout a warning. It slammed into River with brutal force. The dog let out a sharp, pained yelp, his body flipping sideways in the water. His jaws instinctively released the boy's jacket, and for a heart-stopping second, everything stopped. Then the current took him. River was gone. Thomas's world blurred. "No!" He lunged, barely managing to grab the boy's jacket as he drifted past. With the last of his strength, he hauled the child onto the rooftop, his own body nearly slipping with the effort. He clutched the shivering boy close, but his eyes remained locked on the water, scanning frantically. River had saved the boy, but the river had taken River. The old fisherman's breath came in ragged gasps, his body trembling with exhaustion and grief. He searched the water, his vision blurring with something hot and stinging, though he refused to call it tears. River had been there, and now he wasn't. "Please," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible against the roaring current. But the river didn't answer. It only raged on, carrying away the one thing he hadn't been ready to lose. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world broken and bruised. The morning light struggled to pierce through the heavy gray sky, casting a pale, somber glow over the devastated town. The flood waters had begun to recede, revealing the skeletons of what once stood. Collapsed houses, shattered fences, uprooted trees. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth, debris, and the faint staleness of stagnant water. Thomas stood on the ruined remains of his cabin's rooftop, his body stiff and aching from the cold. The boy he had pulled from the river huddled close, wrapped in the tattered remains of Thomas's old coat. The child, no older than 5 or 6, had dark curls that clung to his forehead, his face smudged with mud and exhaustion. His brown eyes, wide and fearful, darted around as if searching for something familiar in the sea of destruction. People had begun emerging from their battered homes, assessing the damage, calling out for loved ones. Miraculously, there had been no reported deaths. Thanks to Thomas's warning, the town had evacuated to higher ground before the worst of the flood struck. But survival came with a cost. Their homes were in ruins, their belongings washed away, their lives forever changed. Sheriff Calloway arrived first, his uniform stained with mud, his usual composed demeanor replaced with one of weary urgency. His blue eyes, usually sharp and observant, were dulled by exhaustion. He had spent the night coordinating rescues, pulling people from rooftops and guiding them to safety. Now, as he approached Thomas, his gaze softened at the sight of the boy. "Jesus, Whitmore," Calloway muttered, crouching beside them. "You saved him?" Thomas, still breathless, gave a stiff nod. River did. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. At the mention of the dog, Calloway's expression turned grim. He glanced at the murky water still pooling around them. "Where is he?" Thomas clenched his jaw. He had been searching, scanning the river, the wreckage, the debris, but there was nothing. No golden fur cutting through the water, no familiar bark, no sign of River. His chest tightened. The dog had saved him, had saved this boy, and now he was gone. The boy, silent until now, sniffled. His voice was small, barely audible. "Doggy?" Thomas swallowed the lump in his throat. "We're gonna find him, kid." But even as he said it, doubt gnawed at him. The hours passed like a slow, agonizing blur. As soon as the boy was safely placed in the care of the town's emergency shelter, Thomas joined the search efforts. He trudged through the mud, his old boots sinking with every step, his hands raw from lifting debris, from pushing through the wreckage of what the flood had left behind. Sarah arrived sometime in the afternoon, her gray braid damp from rain, her coat splattered with dirt. Her face, usually calm and composed, was lined with worry. She didn't ask questions, she simply joined him. They searched together, side by side, combing through the ruins along the riverbank, calling River's name into the silent wasteland. Others helped too, men who had known Thomas for years, women who had once dismissed him as a gruff old man with nothing left to lose. But today, no one questioned his desperation, because they had all seen what River had done. As the sun began its slow descent, exhaustion weighed heavily on Thomas's shoulders. The ache in his bones was nothing compared to the grief settling in his chest. Maybe River was gone. Maybe, just like Max, the river had taken him. Thomas felt something inside him break at the thought. Then, just as he was about to stop, he heard it. A sound. Faint, weak, but unmistakable. A whimper. His heart slammed against his ribs. He spun toward the direction of the noise, feet moving before his mind could catch up. Near the base of an old oak tree, tangled in a mess of broken branches and waterlogged debris, lay a small golden shape. River. The dog was barely moving, his wet fur matted with mud and leaves, his body shivering violently. One of his back legs was twisted at an odd angle, and a deep gash marred his side. His breathing was shallow, each rise and fall of his chest labored and slow. But he was alive. Thomas fell to his knees beside him, his hands trembling as they reached out, brushing against River's damp fur. The dog's eyes fluttered open at the touch, and despite everything, his tail gave the faintest wag. "You stupid, stubborn mutt," Thomas choked out, his voice thick with emotion. River whimpered again, his head weakly pressing into Thomas's palm. Sarah knelt beside them, exhaling shakily. "We need to get him warm. Fast." Thomas didn't hesitate. He scooped the dog into his arms, ignoring the protest in his joints, ignoring the mud that smeared across his shirt. He held River close, feeling the slow, fragile beat of his heart against his chest. The old fisherman, who had spent so many years believing he had no one left to lose, felt his eyes sting. He had almost lost him. Almost. River shivered in his grip, but he was still breathing. And as long as he was breathing, Thomas wasn't letting go. As he carried the dog back toward what was left of his home, Sarah walking beside him, he whispered something into River's ear. A promise. "You're gonna be okay, boy. I got you." And this time, no force of nature was going to take him away. River's recovery was slow but steady. The first few weeks were the hardest. The injuries from the flood had left the young golden retriever weak, unable to stand without trembling. His back leg, once strong and swift, now bore the weight of the trauma, healing with a slight limp that would never fully disappear. The deep gash along his side had closed, but the scar remained, a permanent reminder of the night he had given everything to save a life. Thomas rarely left his side. The man who had once lived in solitude, who had spent years convincing himself he needed no one, now found himself watching over River like a worried parent. He set up an old quilted blanket near the fireplace, making sure the pup was warm. Every morning he gently cleaned the wound with careful hands, his rough fingers surprisingly soft against River's fur. He boiled chicken and rice, feeding the dog small portions, coaxing him to eat even when the pain dulled his appetite. River, despite the pain, never once turned away from him. Their bond had deepened, forged through the storm, through loss, through survival. Sarah came by often, bringing supplies, medicinal salves for River's wounds, fresh food, and sometimes just company. She never said much about what had happened that night, never spoke of how close Thomas had come to losing the dog. But she watched the way he moved now, how he reached down to scratch River's ears absent-mindedly, how his gruff exterior softened whenever the dog whimpered in pain. "You love that dog," she remarked one evening, sipping coffee on his front porch. Thomas grunted, which was his way of agreeing. Sarah smirked. "You're a terrible liar." Thomas didn't argue. Instead, he looked out toward the river, now calm and unassuming, as if it had never been the monstrous force that nearly took everything from them. The town had begun to rebuild. The damage left by the flood was severe, but not beyond repair. Houses were being restored, streets cleared of debris. Neighbors who had once only exchanged polite greetings now worked together, sharing meals, lending tools, offering hands to lift what was too heavy alone. And in the middle of it all, they talked about River, the dog that had warned them of the dam, the dog that had saved a child, a hero. People stopped by the cabin more than ever before, asking about River, offering him treats, scratching behind his ears as they told Thomas, "That dog of yours, Whitmore, he's something special." Thomas didn't disagree. Months passed, and River grew stronger. His limp remained, but he learned to adjust. He chased after butterflies in the field behind the cabin, barked at fish in the shallows of the river, napped in the shade of the old oak tree. But no matter what, he never strayed too far from Thomas. The old fisherman had changed too. He no longer sat alone at the river's edge, lost in old memories. He no longer grumbled when Sarah dropped by unannounced, pretending not to enjoy her company. He even made an effort to visit the town, something he hadn't done in years. Because now, he wasn't just Thomas Whitmore, the old man by the river. He was River's owner, the man who had saved a dog, only to be saved by him in return. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Thomas sat on the porch, watching River doze beside him. The golden fur shimmered under the fading light, the soft rise and fall of his breath steady. peaceful. Thomas reached down, running a hand over the scar along River's side. "You scared the hell out of me. You know that?" he muttered. River's tail thumped once against the wooden planks, as if to say, "Yeah, I know." Thomas exhaled, leaning back against his chair, staring at the horizon. For years, he had lived believing he was meant to be alone, that solitude was easier, that there was no point in holding on to things, because life had a cruel way of taking them away. But River had proven him wrong. Love wasn't about holding on too tight. It was about standing beside each other, through storms and stillness alike. And Thomas knew, as long as he had River by his side, he would never be alone again. Not anymore, not ever. Life has a way of leading us down unexpected paths. Sometimes it takes a storm, both the ones outside and the ones within, to remind us of what truly matters. Thomas believed he was destined to be alone. That loss was something he had to endure in silence. But God had other plans. River wasn't just a dog. He was a miracle, a living testament to the love and loyalty that God places in the hearts of his creations. Just as Thomas had pulled River from the river that fateful night, River, in turn, saved Thomas, not just from the flood, but from a life of loneliness and regret. God's miracles aren't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes they come in the form of a loyal companion, a second chance, a reason to open our hearts again. River's story is a reminder that love, no matter where it comes from, is a gift from God, one that should never be taken for granted. If this story touched your heart, we encourage you to share it with others. Maybe someone out there needs to be reminded that even in the darkest storms, God's light still shines through. Comment below if you've ever had an animal change your life, or if you believe, like Thomas, that sometimes God sends us exactly who we need at the right time. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories like this. Stories of faith, love, and the miracles that walk among us, sometimes on four legs. May God bless you, protect you, and fill your life with the unconditional love that only He can provide. Amen.